Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one we'll be covering the last developments of the month of January. And we see that the Russians have managed to advance in the direction of Toretsk to the north of town. The Russians have managed to advance and close the encirclement of Ukrainian forces south of Toretsk. The Russians also managed to advance in the southern and northern flanks of the west of Kharkiv. The Russians have managed to advance north of Velika Novosilka and to the southwest of the town. Starting out in the direction of Toretsk, the Russians have managed to advance and capture the farm area in the northern parts of Toretsk. They've also managed to capture the town of Novomlinsk along the Oskil River line, expanding their zone of control in the northern direction. We see that if the Russians move in the southern direction, they'll be moving along a more urbanized area, as there's the towns of Kupiansk and a lot around them, as well as several fortified positions, while in the northern direction it is fairly unprotected in comparison, and the towns and settlements are more sparse. Therefore, the Russians can gain control over a larger area where they can spread out their forces with less resistance being faced in the northern direction, and therefore we may be seeing more offensive operations for the Russians in the northern and northwestern direction to gain further control of the Oskil River line, potentially even connecting with the border area between Russia and Ukraine. The issue for the Russians here in the northern parts is that there are no significant supply lines they can make use of from the northern direction. The town of Veloiki has a railway connection which they can make use of. However, it will be limited by the Ukrainian strikes across the border area. That means they need to secure the border area for it to be used. And even then, the roads are limited in size and number. This makes it difficult for the Russians to supply a large grouping of forces. Instead, the logical move would be for the Russians to concentrate the forces and connect the highway between Kupiansk and Vovchansk to gain control over this highway will allow the Russians to start supplying larger forces. At the same time, they'll never be able to compete with the supply of Kharkiv. However, with Belgorod nearby and through the highway to be able to pass through Vovchansk and gain control over the area and concentrate larger forces in the area. But for that, the stalemate in the Kharkiv region needs to be broken, and the Russians will need to connect the two sides from Toretsk in the south to Vovchansk in the north. At the same time, the Russians will also look to gain control of the area between Svatove and Kupiansk, as that will allow the Russians to have an additional supply route to the northern and western directions and supply again a larger force west of the Oskil River line, and then expanding southwards along the Oskil River line will again supply the Russians with additional forces, leading to control over Izium and Liman in the south, will again allow the Russians to concentrate more forces. That means that the more the Russians gain control of along the Oskil River line, the larger forces they can supply and the bigger, faster and stronger offensive operations they can launch. All of this requires for them to break the current stalemate across the front, where they need to gain control over Toretsk, Kupiansk, Borova, Vovchansk, Shevchenko, Izium and Liman. And at that point, we can see the return of the Russian forces in the Kharkiv region and potential offensive operations towards the city of Kharkiv, towards the rear flank of the Donetsk region, and so on. To the south of Toretsk, the Russians have managed to close the encirclement of Ukrainian forces along the fortified positions to the southwest of the city, and with this the Russians have secured the southern flank of Toretsk and will now be moving on to the fortified positions on the western outskirts, following the control of which the Russians will be able to advance towards the reservoir, where the Ukrainian resistance will be limited due to the Russian control of the southern and northern flanks. This allows the Russians to have a more secure flank to attack the fortified positions and therefore not having too much risk in their offensive operations. At the same time, we see that the Russians will be likely moving along the high ground, along the fortified positions to the west of Chervenivka and Novosibirsk. Gaining control of these fortified positions will gain control over the western flank and allow the Russians to push further northwards, and we'll see heavy fighting along the Toretsk River west of Toretsk and along the fortified positions to the west of the city. In the Pokrovsk section of the front line, there are no developments over the past 24 hours, and therefore the changes that happened in January is marked out as such. In the west of Kharkiv, the Russians managed to capture the fortified area in the eastern part of Andriivka and secured the road between Shevchenko and Andriivka. At the same time, the Russians also managed to expand their control and gain control over the road between Yantarne and Dashne, west of Kharkiv. The Russians are here attacking both the northern and southern flanks, both in the direction of Andriivka, Alekli, Konstantinopel, Dashne, as the Russians slowly move along to gain control over the northern and southern banks of the Oskil River line and the Sukhoi River line, gain control over Dashne, the fortified position Alekli, Konstantinopel and Andriivka, before moving on to the Dnipropetrovsk border area. The Russians also managed to advance north of Novy Kumar, gaining control over an additional forest line and fighting over the fortified positions of the Ukrainians west of Rostolne, north of Novy Kumar, as the Russians look to gain control over the eastern bank of the river line here north of Novy Kumar and to secure the western flank for a push towards Bahatir, Rosliv, and Odradne. The Russians also managed to advance west of Velika Novosilka along the fortified areas west of the town, where they're looking to gain control over the forest lines and fields up towards Novosilka, to advance alongside the road towards the flank of the fortified positions of the Ukrainians northwest of Velika Novosilka, located on the high ground. For the month of January, we see that the Russians have managed to capture Velika Novosilka. They advanced west of Kharkiv, gaining control over Yantarne, and reaching the outskirts of Konstantinopel, Rosliv, and Alekli. The Russians started storming Andriivka, gaining a foothold within the town and gaining control over several fortified positions to the east of it. Russians managed to gain control over the remaining parts of Shevchenko, Petropavlivka, the entirety of Slovianka, Yasenove, the west of Novochelysevitivka, Novoandriivka, storming Nadiivka and gaining control of the southern parts of the town, capturing several fortified positions along the western flank of Pokrovsk, gaining control over Kotlina, gaining foothold within Udashne, gaining control over the remaining parts of Solone, Novovasilivka, and storming Uspenivka, fighting and contesting the town. The Russians gained control of the remaining parts of Pishane, storming Svirove, gaining control of the railway north of Shevchenko, gaining full control of Selene, the southern parts of Lysivka, flanking Sukhoi from the east and the west. The Russians managed to gain control over Vostyshenka, Baranivka, started gaining a foothold within Yelisavetivka, but there's a hotly contested area with a lot of back and forth between the Russian and Ukrainian forces. Russians managed to reach and intercept the highway intersection between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka. Russians started offensive operations towards the pocket area in between Toretsk and Vostyshenka. The Russians gained control of the remaining parts of Toretsk, fortified positions to the southwest of it, stormed Sherebenivka and Novospassky, getting a foothold within Novospassky, gaining control of half of Sherebenivka, and the final fortified positions to the west of Toretsk are now under attack. The Russians managed to gain control over significant portions of Chasiv Yar. This will lead to the full control over the city by the Russian forces within the next few days or weeks. The Russians did some probing operations in the direction of Verkhnokamiansky and Orehovo-Vasilivka, where they poked into the Ukrainian defenses. The Russians crossed over the Serbis River line, getting control over Ivanivka and Bilorivka, and is now fighting over the fortified positions west of the town. Russians expanded their foothold across the Serbis River line near Makiivka, gained control over Novoyehorivka, and started storming Tverdo-Klibove. Contesting the town between the Russian and Ukrainian forces, the Russians managed to gain control over some fortified positions west of Losova, southeast of Sahrisove, and some back and forth that happened in Koslinikivka, where the Ukrainians attempted to regain full control over the town, but the Russians pushed back to secure their foothold within it. The Russians managed to make significant advances across the Oskil River line, gaining full control over Devorishna and Zapatne, as well as Novomlinsk, and are now fighting to expand their foothold across the river line and to launch further offensive operations across. In the Kharkiv section of the front line, there's a small advance by the Russians, otherwise it's completely stale. And in the Kursk region, we see that the Russians captured Makhnovka, but were then pushed out as the Ukraine recaptured it. The Ukrainians launched an offensive operation that ended in complete failure, as they only managed to capture a few forest lines and their forces were wiped out. The Russians managed to launch some counterattacks where they managed to regain control over Leonidovo, storm several positions along the Luknia river line, and push the Ukrainians towards the outskirts of Svetlikovo, while the Ukrainians managed to regain control over Orlovka and Novaya Shoroshina, where they saw much more success than in the eastern parts, where they attempted a significant pushback but ended up failing completely. And that is going to be all for this update and the recap of this month. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.